what you're looking at when you do that kind of stuff? It's actually, from our perspective, simpler than it might seem. There's a million pieces of information you can get off of that, but from the emergency department perspective, we're really only worried about a small subset of things, right? We look at trauma folks and we look at whether or not they've got fractures or they've got blood in their head. We look at stroke patients because we want to see if they've got bleeding that's causing the stroke, or maybe they've got a blood clot that's blocking off the blood supply to the brain that's causing stroke. And if that happens, that part of the brain will get kind of swollen as it dies off, and you can actually see the swelling. We look for things like too much fluid building up in the brain or not enough fluid building up in the brain. We look for things like tumors, and that's really about it. The neurologist will look a lot farther than that. So there was a study done like 22, 23 years ago that says, can we come up with a sweet, short mnemonic to give to brand new emergency medicine residents to teach them how to remember how to read a head CT? And they came up with this mnemonic called blood can be very bad, which makes sense because we know blood on CT is really bad. So that BCBVB, blood can be very bad, is the mnemonic that I always run through, and a lot of our residents run through when they're looking at this. And it's just a way to remind you to look at 5 different things. The first one, the first B, stands for blood. And what they mean by that is just, it's okay to go look for the sexy stuff on the head CT right up front. Go ahead and look for the blood, because that's the cool stuff that we want to see.
Is it darker?
It's actually, new blood is white.
Yeah, it's white.
It's kind of weird on CT.
Yeah, it's a new bleed. It stands
The
out.
darkest stuff is usually water.
Mm-hmm.
The medium dense stuff like brain is kind of gray. And then blood, which is probably denser than most other things because it's got a lot of iron in the hemoglobin, actually looks kind of whitish on here. So this isn't the world's greatest picture.
No, but you can see where the bleed is.
There we go. That's pretty good. So as we scroll up and down through this head CT here,
Oh, something else we did. No.
notice-
They gave up.
Hang on, let me see if I can find a better picture.
It's a camera.
It's a camera.
No, you can go.
Hey,
It's a lunch line. It's stop.
Really? Come on. There we go. All right. It's not as contrasty as I'd like to see it. But if you look at this area right here, this little lake
Yeah.
actually looks a little bit lighter, a little bit whiter than most of this other stuff out here. Is that visible at all? I know it's really subtle, and that's
Barely.
yeah. It's usually a lot more dramatic than that.
Mm-hmm.
But also, if you look over here,
it's a little shade.
yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
yeah,
is.
exactly.
It'll be a lighter shade of what is
Right.
happening everywhere. You can kind of tell
Like
there's
a new
something
one,
going
you know,
on
a
there.
new one, X-ray's kind of
Mhm.
like different shades.
Mhm.
Right.
The outline a little bit.
Yeah, it
That's
can be-
hard to see though.
If you get darker, it makes it easier.
It can be really subtle. Let's see if I can find that. You know what? Hang on, let me check
And
this.
the
I
brain.
might be able
How to
to.
read a head CT in 5 seconds. 5 seconds.
Come on, please go. Okay, cool. This is, Andy Perrin is actually the guy who came up with that mnemonic that we were talking about. Way back when he was a resident. And look in here, see there's some pictures. There we go. That's what it's gonna look like a little bit more. So blood is going to be hyperdense. It's going to be white. And bleeding inside the brain comes in 3 or 4 different flavors. There's this one that's called the epidural bleed. And that's one that's usually lens-shaped. That's bleeding way outside of the brain, way outside of the meninges itself, right up against the bone. And this is spooky because that's a high-pressure balloon of blood in there. So that usually winds up having to go to surgery to get a whole board in it to take the pressure off. Blood can also come in like the middle part of the brain. If you get an aneurysm that ruptures in this middle part here, then blood will leak up along all the sort of cracks where the lobes overlap each other. That's going to be your classic subarachnoid bleed. And then where else? We got a subdural one in here somewhere. And there's gotta be another one with some blood.
Blood can be very bad.
That's the acronym they use for the things they're looking for.
All right.
Thank
The
you.
third one is going to be a subdural bleed, which just kind of comes and crescent shape wraps around the brain here. Maybe a picture of that one. Where did our text thing go? If you look at this right here, again, it's not real high contrast, but there's a little streak of blood that just kind of comes around and wraps around the surface of the brain here. That's more of your subdural bleeding. That's more common in like elderly people whose brain just rattles around inside the skull when they fall and they jostle it. That's usually lower pressure blood, and that often doesn't need to go to the operating room. Other places you can get blood are, where did my stuff go? I lost it. You can get bleeding inside the parenchyma of the brain itself. So you can get bleeding just like inside the meat there, which often comes from hypertensive bleeds. And you can get blood inside the ventricles. Let's see if they got a picture of the blood inside the ventricles. Maybe it'll be lower. I'm just gonna measure it. Okay, good. These are the pictures I was looking for. So B, this is all the different kind of blood. You know, the epidural one, which is that high pressure lens-shaped one that's so dangerous. There's another picture of it right there. Or you can have the, where's the subdural one? There's a classic subdural one. This kind of curve shaped wrapping around the brain. That's usually low pressure. Older people with a lot of brain atrophy, alcoholic EM docs, people like that. And then you can get the subarachnoid hemorrhage, which is the one that bleeds on the inside in all the cracks of the brain. You can get the intraparenchymal bleeds, which are the bleeds right inside the meat of the brain. Tumors will bleed like that sometimes, or blood vessels that rupture, and they will bleed like that sometimes. And then sometimes you can actually get it ruptured into the ventricles themselves, the big holes in the middle of the brain. So that's really the 5 places that we look for blood. And we just kind of scan up and down looking for this really high contrast white stuff to stand out. If you see that, you're almost done. That's a call to the neurosurgeons. They're going to get admitted to the neuro ICU. And they're either going to go to the operating room to get that extra blood out, or if the bleeding is stopped and they don't need to be operated on, they're still at least going to have the underlying cause of the bleeding addressed. If the blood pressure is too high, they'll lower the blood pressure. If it's a tumor, they'll deal with the tumor. So that's the first B. B is for blood. C, blood can. C is for cisterns. You guys know what the cisterns are on the brain? If you have the pencil, do you? Yeah. If you look at the brain, the brain's kind of shaped like that, and it folds over itself. It's kind of like a big head of cauliflower. It grows up out of a stalk, and then the top of it wraps over and comes up underneath. So if you were to cut a line through here, if you were to take that brain and cut it in that section, the actual cross section of the brain would look kind of like this. With the brain stem poking up through the middle. And then there's this space. This part right here that is sort of empty space is going to look like a circle around it. And then you've got the rest of the brain on the outside. So even though that circle looks like it's inside the brain, it's actually these folds in there. And there's multiple different folds where all the different lobes come over and fold in. The reason those are important to look at is because that's one of them right there. That's just a fold. It's actually outside the brain. But those spaces should always be there. If the brain starts to swell, what do you think is going to happen to those spaces? They're going to disappear, right? The brain gets bigger, it pushes the hole smaller. Kind of like when a donut gets bigger, the donut hole shrinks and disappears. So if you don't see a lot of obvious blood, then you're asking yourself, okay, maybe I'm missing something subtle, like swelling inside the brain. So we'll look at these cisterns. This one happens to be called the quadrigeminal cistern. You don't even know the names and stuff. Quadrigeminal cistern again. And when that brain swells, this little open space gets mashed off and disappears. So if you're looking for those cisterns and you don't find them there, that's a sign of swelling around the brain.